Kids are routinely monitored for symptoms of all kinds of diseases, from asthma to obesity. But a pediatric practice on Cape Cod, kids are also screened for the warning signs of another disease, addiction. As Stephanie Lydon reports, it's a novel approach to tackling the opioid crisis.
In many ways, Cape Cod is an idyllic place to grow up. Like anywhere else, though, it's easy enough to head down the wrong path.
To be honest, I liked it at first.
This boy, who asked that we call him Heath and disguise his identity, was in 8th grade when he started smoking pot. Getting it, he says, took little more than a swipe on his phone. He says it eased his anxiety about school.
8th grade, I don't know why, but it was kind of stressful for me. So I guess, I kind of got rid of the stress in a way.
Not sure where else to turn, his mom brought him to his pediatrician's office, where he met Katie DeTolo. She's a mental health clinician, called in when a kid's using drugs or alcohol, or when there are other red flags like depression and anxiety. There's a link between mental health and the opioid crisis?
I think there's a link between untreated mental health and addictive disease, yes. If a young child struggled with anxiety, so to say, and they didn't learn skills or tools to how to navigate those feelings, eventually that child could find reprieve in substance.
DeTolo gives kids, sometimes as young as 4 years old, skills to manage emotions.
So we put a name on it and we talk about it, and I encourage them to really enhance the ways that they communicate around their emotions.
She works for Gosnold, a Cape Cod detox and addiction treatment center. People are desperate to get in here, but DeTolo's boss says the solution to the opioid crisis is not just more treatment beds. He came up with the idea of placing a Gosnold clinician in a pediatrician's office because, like most other diseases, addiction is easier to treat, even prevent, if you detect symptoms early.
Once someone begins and becomes addicted to an opiate and is now using heroin or fentanyl, we're talking about crisis intervention upon crisis intervention. What we're trying to do here is see those signals earlier and help people manage them.
This young man here.
Pediatrician Leif Norenberg says having DeTolo on his team removes the stigma of mental health care, makes it as routine as a checkup.
We have scores of stories of kids who have had little problems that we nipped in the bud, and now they're doing fine. They're fully functional. They're off their drugs. And others, we have some work to do, I would say. It's a never-ending thing.
The availability and power of opioids ups the ante for any kid who experiments with drugs. Heath, now a high school junior, says his early experience informs his current decision-making.
I think also a big part of that is talking to Katie, and she helped me be able to, when time comes around, be able to say no.
Stephanie Lydon joins me now. Hey there, Stephanie.
Hey, Jim.
How typical is the young man's story, the 8th grader smoking pot? How typical is that?
Fairly typical, according to the pediatrician. He says he sees kids as young as 12. He's seeing more of it. And the concern is that pot today is different, stronger than it was a generation ago. Opioids, he also sees they're available and, as we know, ultimately deadly.
Can we go down from the 8th grader to the 4-year-old? You mentioned this thing.
Yeah.
I'm assuming the 4-year-old's not an opioid user. And if they're not born addicted, what's this about?
Right. This is all about prevention.
Oh, it is. Okay.
So with the 4-year-old, they're looking at things like anxiety. Say that kid has anxiety every time she goes into a room full of strangers. If she doesn't deal with that anxiety now, the thinking is, as a teenager, she experiments with drugs, alcohol that eases the anxiety, could lead to
so it's recognizing behaviors that are potentially addictive behaviors and make that 4-year-old a more likely user at some point.
Could ultimately lead to addiction, like the way a doctor might see signs of obesity and work to change behavior in a kid. Very similar.
So we have one mental health a clinician in one pediatric practice. Is Gosnold trying to replicate this elsewhere? Are other practices trying to do this kind of thing?
There are a few other projects like this going on. This is a pilot project. It's funded by a grant. The trick is scaling it because traditionally insurance companies pay for mental health one way, they pay for physical health the other, and merging them is a trick. There's really no mechanism at this point to pay for this kind of integrated service.
It's great for doing it, though. Stephanie, thanks so much. Appreciate it.